What if you're 58 when you finally realize what you should have done with your life? I always had a feeling that I was born too late and took the wrong path. As I've written before on my blog, I never really knew what I wanted to do with my life and just kind of fell into a 30-year career for lack of a definitive dream or sense of purpose. I've always had an interest in popular culture, music, art, fashion, literature, and movies from generations before mine. I just had no clue how to make that interest into a living or a life. I now know that I should have done something with music, maybe the history and culture of rock and roll or something like that. Oh well, I'm glad I finally figured it out. Part of my deep conviction that I was born in the wrong decade has a lot to do with cultural influences of growing up as an early Gen Xer. Movies, music, TV shows that I watched and listened to when I was a kid made deep impressions on me. When I was a kid in the early to mid 70s, I wished desperately that I had lived in the 1950s, all due to watching Happy Days on TV. Saddle shoes and circle skirts were what I wanted to wear. I was thrilled when I got the Dick Clark 25 Years of Rock and Roll double album via my Columbia House Record and Tape Club membership. It had Carl Perkins' blue suede shoes, Bill Haley, Fats Domino, all those classics. And then the movie that made the biggest impact on my life when I was a very impressionable 12-year-old middle schooler, Grease. Of course, this was released in the stellar year of 1978. That really made me wish I had been a teen in the 1950s. Rizzo was totally my role model, dressed all in black with that sassy attitude. Those dances, the drive-in movies, Grease Lightning, the car race for pink slips. My preteen heart. And then a year or so, maybe 2 years later, I moved on. I was done with the 50s. I became thoroughly enthralled with the idea of what it would have been like to have been a teen in the 60s when I was awed by the film Hair, which I saw at the Cinema One, the old movie theater in the Village Hall building that was kind of scary, had bats flying around in the, upstairs. And for several years, when the Summer School of the Arts program would convene on the SUNY Fredonia campus, they would always show movies at the amphitheater outside, and Hair was one of the films that they showed every year, and I always made sure never to miss it. That movie changed my life and permanently imprinted on my brain that I should have been a hippie, protested at anti-war rallies, gone to Woodstock. Here's a funny story. My aunt, who is a nun, appears in the early scenes of the documentary about Woodstock. She and two other sisters happened to be traveling on the New York State Thruway and got stuck at the same time that thousands of young people were headed to Max Yesker's farm. You can see them in their habits at about 8:36 if you watch. One of the young sisters flashes the peace sign. It's really sweet. This desire to have been a teen in the 60s continued into high school with my passionate love of the Beatles and other bands like The Who, Led Zeppelin, Crosby, Stills and Nash, The Zombies, The Doors, Jefferson Airplane. All my friends and I read the Jim Morrison biography, No One Here Gets Out Alive. The hedonism and debauchery in the book and of the times was completely alluring to me, as were Jim Morrison's leather pants. I also had a deep interest in being a mod with cool mini dresses and gorgeous boots like Edie Sedgwick and hobnobbing with Andy Warhol at the factory. I was terribly disillusioned when I asked my parents what happened to all the hippies, and they told me that they grew up to just become regular old people. Teachers, doctors, plumbers, lawyers, moms, dads. That information just completely deflated me. I don't know what I thought happened to them, but not that. In the midst of these competing fever decade dreams was when I saw the clean version of Saturday Night Fever. That really sent me into a tizzy. I previously wrote on my blog about my deep lust of 1970s John Travolta. 1970s Brooklyn and Manhattan were about as far away from my life as the moon, and were so captivating to this small town girl. 70s disco fashion and the Bee Gees had me thinking that going to clubs and dancing every night in search of Tony Manero was what my destiny might be. My love of this movie endured for decades, and I literally devoured an article in New York Magazine about the original story that I read about 15 years ago that started the whole craze. The article was called Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night by Nick Cohn. The former was a look back at the original article and included photos and details about the making of the movie. I refuse to read anything about Cohn making up the original piece. I will forever pretend that it was completely based on real people and real situations, even if I know better. And this brings me to my other all-time favorite movie set in the 1970s, Dazed and Confused. I personally know people that each of the characters in this film could have been based on. So unlike Saturday Night Fever, these kids are totally real to me. I recently saw a post on social media that cruelly pointed out that the year it came out, 1993, was closer to the time period it depicted in 1976 than it is today. Yikes. I was 10 years old during the bicentennial, what I wouldn't have given to have been about 6 years older. To have been a teenager in the late 70s, I imagine, would have been awesome. Bell bottoms, platform shoes, the music, cool cars like Corvettes, Camaros, Trans Am Firebirds, Aerosmith concerts at the height of their first round of popularity. The scene in the movie when redheaded Cynthia, the character played by Marissa Ribisi, talks about the every other decade theory. The 50s were boring, the 60s were great, the 70s were terrible, so the 80s were destined to be better is so funny. I think the audience laughed out loud at this scene when I saw it in the theater. Right, the 80s would be better. Reaganism, the moral majority, conspicuous consumption, yuppies. Yeah, not that great. But in retrospect, I'm glad I was a kid in the 80s rather than a kid now. But back in the 70s, teens were way more free than they are today to experiment, explore, to just be young. In my opinion, this is one of the best movies for capturing the look, the feel, the fashion, the lingo, just the whole zeitgeist of an era. There is nothing that rings false about the mid-70s in this film. When I entered high school in the fall of 1980, a lot of the same things like hazing and partying were still part of the teenage experience. By today's standards, those rituals would be considered bullying. Back then, they were just considered rites of passage. Another thing that was different, and by different I mean better, in the 70s was ease of access to and interest in live music. I came across a post in a group I follow on Facebook that shared a picture from a newspaper for a series of concerts that a local Cleveland concert promoter was advertising from sometime in the mid-late 70s. There were 8 different concerts at venues in the Cleveland area, and each show had 2 or 3 groups performing. One show was Journey with both Montrose and Van Halen as openers. Van Halen was opening, that blew my mind. Another was The Outlaws with Jay Ferguson opening. Tickets were priced from $6 to $7 and could be purchased at Ticketron locations and at Sears and May Company department stores. In an earlier post, I recall being able to buy concert tickets at Kaufman's department store, which was a part of the May Company. They could also be purchased at Peach's record and tape stores. Gosh, going to the record store was so much fun. Perusing the bins of records was an adventure into itself. The comments on the Facebook post were interesting and telling. Many of them were about how affordable it used to be to see national acts, how great the shows were, how many people went to several of the shows, and also how few concerts of this caliber there are anymore in what are considered smaller markets. More evidence that I should have been born in a different decade. So a couple things I want to add here at the end is that I recently saw the Rolling Stones in Cleveland. It was my first time seeing them. I figured I'd better see them now or it might possibly be never. They were absolutely fantastic, animated, having fun. They sounded amazing. It's hard to believe how old they are. It gives me hope that there is a full life to be lived well into seniorhood. And when I got home that weekend, I watched the Bret Michaels bio documentary on A&E. What a fun trip back to the 80s that was. I mean, I was never a fan of Poison or that kind of music when it was popular, but I've really come to like Bret Michaels as a person. He just seems like a really good, genuine guy. And the tenacity of that band and their attempts to make it was phenomenal. I love that Bret still has that Yinzer way of speaking. I love his attitude of thankfulness and appreciation of his fans, and he's still out there touring. So maybe I guess being 58 in 2024 is an okay decade, in which to be listening to music. It isn't so bad after all.